Hello everyone, this is Professor D, your course creator, and we are going to have a conversation about privilege. And I'm sure you're like, oh boy, I'm excited. We're going to talk about privilege. But while this is not something that is easy or fun to explore, it's something that's absolutely critical and crucial to know and understand. Because when we have a sense of how the world treats our overvalued social identities, the ones that it takes too much, like it treats too well, white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered. That means like you feel as though you were born into the body you were born into. So I feel I'm a male and I feel as though I am male, so I'm cisgender, right? We have to understand how the world overvalues people with those identities and how that sense of overvaluing comes at the cost of people who aren't that way and what it means to people who aren't that way. So a great way to frame that discussion is to watch this quick video from Trevor Noah talking about reparations and talking about white privilege. I feel like this was really, really well done.
You guys have any questions before we move on? Anything you want to chat about?
No, good. Yes, sir.
That's an interesting question.
What do you mean by that? If I
There are like white people that have like been disenfranchised like recently, like
recently is the key. Recently is the key.
industrialized, right? So like a lot of people in like manufacturing jobs and stuff, like
Right. But so to your question, I think you have to understand what the word reparations means first. So reparations, you are repairing something that you have broken. You are paying for something that you were supposed to pay for. I'm not saying that there aren't people living in America today who are suffering and are going through pain and strife because of what's happening when it comes to the machines taking jobs, factories becoming industrialized, etc. But reparations is a specific conversation about a specific time in America, and that is black people were slaves. You know what I mean? I've even heard people say like, oh, but there were some of the Irish who were indentured. Like, yeah, that's slavery. Look at the numbers, look at the time, look at the level of work. You could not work toward your freedom. For most black people in America, this was a time when you lived and died as a slave. And so that's what reparations is about. And so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a completely separate conversation that needs to be had about the now. Because if you are not careful, what you then do is you combine everybody's suffering into the same ball and you make it seem like all injustices have the same weighting, and they don't. It's just like crimes. Theft isn't the same as murder. We don't try them the same way. And as much as there is a white person who's suffering today, I feel for anybody who's suffering because I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to suffer. I didn't come from a wealthy family. We struggled when I was growing up. But I also understand that there are levels of that suffering. And so sometimes white people, it does block a white person because you go white privilege, and the person goes, I'm poor and I'm white. Where's the privilege? White people are like, I wish I could activate my white privilege. I wish I could do it right now. White privilege, give me something. I get that. I get that. Trust me, I get it. It is hard to accept that you have benefits because of the color of your skin if you cannot see the benefits that you have. But the thing I try to explain to a person is, think of it more like golf. Don't think of it as privilege, then think of it like a handicap. Right? In golf, they acknowledge that you are in a position where you need so many advantages to be competitive in the game. Right? So what they say is you have a handicap of 15, so that means like you're going to be hitting from this tee and you get more chances to get the ball in because we understand the position you're in. And if you're a black person in America, from slavery, from day one, the number of injustices that have held black people back in America amount to an insurmountable. Like you look at black people's freedom, you look at black people's land, just land alone. The amount of wealth you can acquire over time if you own land is exponential because you have the land, you have the fact that you can borrow based on the land, you have the fact that you can use the money that you have borrowed to grow more wealth, you can use it to grow your family's wealth. Just taking that away from black people alone is crippling them. And so you combine that with slavery, and then you look at Jim Crow laws. You didn't let black people in America live in the areas that they wanted to live in. They couldn't get loans from the banks that they wanted to get loans from. And then on top of that, when they started getting the loans from American banks were found to be giving them higher interest rates when in fact they were the same risk as many of the other races that they were giving loans to. So when you combine all of those things, I think it's safe to say that black Americans have a conversation that they need to be having with the United States. Doesn't involve me, doesn't involve white people, it's like, yo, American government, meet the black people. That's it. Have that conversation.
So I felt like, again, that was a really great way of summarizing those thoughts, those ideas, and give you a sense of where we're going to kind of go and talk about this, right? Because again, he didn't say like, you white person, random white person on the street, you need to do something about reparations. He recognized that the American government and folks that have been in a space where they have been wealthy for generations upon generations need to think about how they're going to work to make the world a little bit more fair for people that have been exploited for a long time. Because it took them a long time to build up that wealth, and it took the folks that have been exploited a long time to get to the place where they're at. What can we do to make the world more fair? How can we address that idea of handicap in just the way that Trevor Noah did? So when we are talking about social identities, this time we're going to be looking at the aged category. Again, these are the people who are valued by society, appreciated by society. These are the people that are in all the movies. These are the people that are on all the TV shows. These are the things that apps are built for. These are the things that people have available to them. And it's easy, and it's very easy to connect with people because of the fact that they have favored social identities. So for this activity, for this class, for this portion of the class, I'm going to ask you to analyze one of the social identities where you have privilege. So with agency. So if you're white, if you're male, if you're able, if you're heterosexual, if you're Christian, if you're were raised in the United States, if you have U.S. citizenship, if the first language that you spoke was English, if you are rich or in a higher socioeconomic class, if your body is not overweight or underweight, that's considered ideal body image privilege. If you're cisgender, I think I gave you some examples of cisgender in your assignment, so you get a sense of what that is and what that looks like. These are going to be the things that you explore for the assignment related to this part of the class. So with that, though, let's look at privilege a little bit more, and how can we understand privilege? Now, I'm going to tell you, if you're not watching the video of this makes the idea of privilege make a lot more sense than just the audio of this is. So if you're watching the audio, tune on in. But if you're just listening to the podcast, go back to the privilege video with the waste paper basket and the paper balls.
I once saw a high school teacher lead a simple, powerful exercise to teach his class about privilege and social mobility. He started by giving each student a scrap piece of paper and asked them to crumple it up. Then he moved the recycling bin to the front of the room. He said, "The game is simple. You all represent the country's population, and everyone in the country has a chance to become wealthy and move into the upper class. To move into the upper class, all you must do is throw your wadded up paper into the bin while sitting in your seat." The students in the back of the room immediately piped up saying, "This is unfair." They could see the rows of students in front of them had a much better chance. Everyone took their shot, and, as expected, most of the students in the front made it, but not all, and only a few students in the back of the room made it. He concluded by saying, "The closer you were to the recycling bin, the better your odds." This is what privilege looks like. Did you notice how the only ones who complained about fairness were in the back of the room? By contrast, people in the front of the room were less likely to be aware of the privilege they were born into. All they can see is 10 feet between them and their goal. Your job as students who are receiving education is to be aware of your privilege and use this particular privilege called education to do your best to achieve great things, all the while advocating for those in the rows behind you.
Again, I thought that was a great way of kind of talking about that idea or getting a sense of what that is and how that works. But it's still, with privilege, I think we need to look at how can we expand on this notion? How can we expand on this idea and understand it differently? Again, this video is a little bit more visual in nature, so if you're only listening to the podcast, I would definitely take time to watch the video for this as well.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on the faucet.
I hate when I click off of the video.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on the faucet. That's my privilege.
I
think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over. I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in, and the job I get to do, and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just a gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you are embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you've ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you're able to move through the world without fear, if you got well into your education, there were more than 50 books in your house. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on. It was very awkward. I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted. And as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all kind of, there was a silence. Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege. Like, oh, but that's not actually me, because like I worked really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward to someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how this is more hard. It's like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school, and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there were questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have.
It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I will do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
So again, I felt like that was really good. I wish we were in person so we could do this activity together and really learn and understand from one another, but this is the second best thing, right? So as you go through that, I hope you were considering about would I go forward, would I go back based on some of the questions they were asking. Now with privilege, here is the definition that we need to understand when we're talking about privilege. It's the idea of having special rights, special abilities, or special immunities that were afforded by birth into a favored social identity. So remember, with privilege, it is not your fault. Like if you're rich, it's not your fault. If you're a man and you identify as male, it's not your fault. If you're heterosexual, it's not your fault. If you're white, it's not your fault. If you spoke English first, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you happen to be privileged. The problem is you get all these extra benefits that other people don't. And the need is to recognize that just by birth, you were born into a favored identity. And because you are of that favored identity, that means you get special rights, special abilities, and special immunities that other people don't get. And they suffer because they don't have them. And you sit back and get all these benefits and you think, well, I didn't do it. It's not my fault. Correct. That's not your fault. But you didn't do anything to earn that. And they didn't do anything to deserve that. And so really getting to a space where we start to understand we have privilege, and privilege is the responsibility to do something for somebody that doesn't have that, is something we want to begin to wrap our minds around as we attempt to be more culturally competent communicators. So how can we be more aware of our privilege? You might have heard this in social justice circles as checking your privilege, but what can we do to see or understand our privilege and get a sense of what all it's beginning to afford to us that other folks don't have, or other folks just don't have the access to? Let's watch the video on checking your privilege.
When people bring up the concept of privilege,
it's usually met with a lot of resistance. People feel privilege think that it means everything that you have is being handed to you. And that's not really what privilege is. Let me give you an example. I was raised in an upper middle class neighborhood. That means I was able to go to a good school. I never had to worry about being in a dangerous neighborhood. I always had access to technology. And there were very few cases in my childhood where money was an issue. I hadn't done anything to earn these privileges. They simply existed for me. See, each of us is born into a world that has history. And that history means that there are certain people that will have less obstacles than others. Being raised upper middle class means that it was very easy for me to, for example, pursue an education. Education that has made it easier for me to recreate the videos that I create. Someone who has less means has to overcome poverty to gain access to good education and technology. That doesn't mean that I didn't have to work hard for the things that I have. I absolutely did. But I also recognize that these things were more accessible to me. All of these things aside, my life has been far from easy. I've had to struggle a lot harder than a lot of people that I know. I've had to overcome a lot of hurdles, especially as a black trans woman. However, that doesn't mean that I haven't benefited from pre-existing structures that have made my life easier. Knowledge of that is what people mean by checking your privilege. You cannot truly fight for equality while fighting to maintain structures that oppress other people. So it's important to check your privilege and be aware that it's there. While I can never deny that there are certain areas where I am privileged, I'm also at the end of the day a black woman, and being a black woman in this world really doesn't come with privileges. Being raised upper middle class does not mean that I don't experience racism. It means that I simply have more tools to cope with it. The reality is that we live in a world where I'm seen as black first and woman second. We currently live in a society that still very much judges and defines people by their race. I have enough money in my pocket to buy the entire store, but I'll still be followed in stores because I'm black. So being privileged in one way does not mean that you aren't oppressed in another, and being oppressed in one way does not always cancel out the privilege that you have in other ways. For example, I recently made a video about gay misogyny where I discussed Andy Cohen's interview with Nicki Minaj. Andy Cohen is a gay white man. His homosexuality, I'm sure, has given him struggle, but he is still a white man. Being both white and male comes with privileges in this country that aren't afforded to black women like Nicki Minaj. On the subject of Andy Cohen, the drastic change in representation of gay characters on television is a great example of how certain privileges exist despite specific types of oppression. Think of just how many gay, white, seemingly heteronormative men are currently on television. Think of how many of them not only host their own television shows, but produce them. I can't think of very many gay black men with media empires behind them outside of RuPaul. And trust me, it's not because there aren't enough qualified black men out there. It's because their face is not the preferred face. Outside the LGBT community, think about the fact that Samuel L. Jackson and Morgan Freeman have both been the token older black men in films since I was a child. There's this notion in Hollywood that if you hire one black person, then suddenly you're good. The notion of filling a quota and tokenizing people of color as a means of saying we're okay ignores the fact that there are other people who aren't really being allowed a chance because society has decided they've met their quota. It's super important to recognize that the success of a few people does not mean that the problem is solved or that privilege no longer exists. In other words, having a black president does not mean that racism is over. There are some people whose possibilities are limited because of existing structures of oppression and privilege. When my father was my age, he wasn't able to pursue the things that I've been able to pursue. And it wasn't because he didn't want to pursue them, it's because he legally wasn't able to. Slavery might have been abolished 152 years ago, but the impact of slavery still exists. Segregation in Boston still existed when my father was a child, and it still exists today in the education system. I understand that when it comes to conversations about privilege, people can become defensive. But leave your feelings at the door and recognize that we're having a much larger conversation here. As I've said, we've each been born into a world that has history, and there are certain structures of power that are in place. And some of those structures benefit some while oppressing others. If you are truly invested in changing that, you'll acknowledge how you benefit from these existing structures. Acknowledging that is truthfully the first step to making those changes, because when you're in a position of privilege, you are an asset of change. The reality is that you're not really helping us fight against these things because you're not willing to acknowledge them for what they really are. You can say that you'd like for things to be better, but if you're not willing to tear down the systems, then you're part of the problem. So on that note, I hope this video helps you check your privilege. As usual, I want you to always remember and don't forget that you are beautiful and you're loved. Bye.
I really enjoyed that video. I think it was very, very helpful in breaking this down and getting a better sense of understanding things. So today, you are going to need to talk about an area where you have agency for the discussion board. I am going to ask you to write down the unearned benefits that you get as being part of this group. So let me give you a couple examples based on my identity so you kind of have a sense of how that works. So I am male. So because I am male, I don't have to worry about walking in dark parking lots. I basically never worry about rape. I don't ever have to consider if I'm ever going to get an abortion or not. If you ever wondered why abortion is going to be considered to be illegal, just think. If men had to carry a baby for 9 months in their body and then push a small watermelon out of their body, I highly doubt that abortion would be legal if, I think in Congress it's 90% men. If that potential outcome was something that those 90% of men were really looking at, I don't know that it would be voted in the same way. Let's look at another part of who I am. Heterosexual. right? So I'm heterosexual, and my heterosexual privilege means I can find a lot of places to find a date. I can go on eHarmony, I can go on Christian Mingle, I can try to pick anybody up at a bar. I don't have to go to a special bar to like find love, right? That's part of my heterosexual privilege, right? Let's look at another area that I have privilege. Christian privilege, right? Because I'm Christian, nobody treats me badly when like a Christian person blows something up or a Christian person shoots up a church. No one starts looking at all Christian people and being like, I don't know about those Christians. Or, again, as a Christian person, I can situationally decide when life matters and it doesn't, right? I can support the death penalty, and I can also say, maybe people shouldn't get abortions as a Christian person, right? And no one thinks I'm a hypocrite, right? Another thing as a Christian that I get is there's a Christian church on every corner. And people don't like sit outside of Christian churches, like, you know, kind of looking suspiciously at all the Christians going to church, right? Again, like, you see how this works. I didn't ask for those things. I just get these things as being part of that group. So again, after that, you're gonna email your professor after you do your first post of initial benefits. So you email me and say, I've done my post about my first list of benefits. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go on the discussion board and I'm gonna post a lot of other things that you may not have considered. So you have a sense of what are other people who don't have your privilege say you get that they don't get, right? What I want you to do is look at them. I want you to ask yourself, why do people without your privilege feel this way? And then I want you to consider adding that to your list if you feel as though this is something you truly get. Now I'm going to warn you, this is going to make you feel uncomfortable. And why? Because we have to recognize that we are being treated unfairly, but we are being treated unfairly in the positive way, right? We're being over-awarded. We're being overvalued for something that we just are, rather than something that we've earned or strived to be. So with this, like, we have to understand, like, with this image, that if you're in the green area, this is where you have privilege. Now, everybody but the people in the green area suffer. And generally speaking, sometimes tend to suffer even harder or worse based on how far away they are from the greenness. So just because you happen to be able, like other folks, like you can see physical disability is really far down the oppression scale when you look at like how people with physical disabilities are treated. Sometimes we don't even look at people with physical disabilities, right? Understanding how this works is really important because it gives you a sense of what is like the favored group and who are other folks that suffer by not being part of that favored group. And what does that strata of difficulty mean for everybody that isn't part of that group, right? Now I'm going to tell you, acknowledging privilege is hard. And we want to understand, because in this class, we're at like, I don't know, like double digits weeks into this class at this point, right? And now we're finally talking about privilege. And you're going to try to talk about privilege to your friends or your family members. And you're going to find that they get angry. Or you're going to find that they're going to get defensive. So why are they angry and defensive? And why are you able to talk about it and examine it in an easier way? Well, because we've been talking about this stuff for 10 weeks. And I've been showing you through activities, through you teaching each other about things and ideas related to this, how this stuff works. I've been incredibly patient with you as you learned about these things, right? But when you come up and you talk to somebody else about their white privilege and you don't have a calm and empathetic conversation, they're going to get defensive and they're going to get angry. And I feel like this video does a good job of explaining what is that process. Why does that happen that way?
When it comes to social justice, there's one word that can stop almost any conversation dead in its tracks: privilege. If you ever stumbled into a conversation about racism, you've probably heard the phrase white privilege, which has been rough on the feathers since the phrase became commonplace in the 1960s. The concept of privilege isn't limited to race. When it's brought up, no matter who you're talking to, too often the response is very correctly: privilege. How dare you! So what exactly is privilege, and why does talking about it make so many people so right, or advantage available only to a particular person or group of people. In the context of social inequality, it means that some groups of people are treated better than others based on their race, gender, class, sexuality, or physical ability. Now, here's the thing about privilege. Everyone has it. You've got privilege! You've got privilege! We've all got privilege! So, for example, as an able-bodied person, I've never struggled to find a bathroom that I can comfortably access, or gone out to lunch with friends to only realize that I can't find a parking spot to get into the restaurant, or even fit through the door. When I turn on my favorite show, I can watch and enjoy with ease because I don't require captions or descriptive narration, which too many shows don't have. So why does talking about privilege make some people angry? I think there are a number of reasons why privilege can be difficult to talk about. Number one, when people hear the word privilege, it feels like they're being blamed. When we use privilege in everyday conversations, we hear phrases like, access is a privilege, not a right. So the vocabulary makes it seem like it's something that you don't deserve. Combine that with the fact that conversations about social inequality tend to be very passionate, it's easy to understand why someone might be upset when check your privilege comes up. No one wants to be the bad guy. And for some people, the concept of privilege feels like they're being blamed for something that's out of their control. Now, when you think about it that way, sure, that's bound to make someone angry. Number two, privilege makes people feel guilty. Talking about privilege is not meant to make you feel guilty. Guilt isn't productive. Acknowledging it isn't about shame. It's about challenging the system that perpetuates inequality. The existence of privilege isn't my fault or your fault. But understanding and acknowledging it is an important first step in working to make a world where these obstacles don't exist. However, ignoring the problem or refusing to acknowledge the problem exists just allows it to continue and thrive. Number three, anger is a defense mechanism. For some people, talking about privilege feels like they're being attacked, or worse yet, that their privilege is going to be taken away. In reality, privilege describes things that everyone should experience. For example, as a straight person, I don't encounter people passing judgment when I'm affectionate with my husband in public. That's not a bad thing. It should be that way for everyone, no matter their sexual orientation. Number four, they just don't understand privilege. The thing about privilege is it's kind of hard to see. It's like when a horse has those blinders on. They can see what's in front of them, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in the peripheral that they can't see. As wonderful as it would be for everyone to be treated fairly no matter who they are, that's just not the world we live in. Privilege doesn't mean you're rich, a bad person, have had everything handed to you, or have never had challenges or struggles. It just means that there are some challenges and struggles that you won't experience because of who you are. So when you've lived your whole life with something, it's hard to understand what it's like for those without. Now, it's impossible for me to guarantee that every time privilege is brought up, it's justified, or that everyone talks about these issues in a responsible way that's free of name-calling or personal attacks. Unfortunately, if you ever had a particularly nasty encounter that included the word privilege, then you would be turned off forever. But if you want to support equality for everyone, which I hope is why you're watching the show, it's important to remember that these conversations are inherently tough but necessary. And the discomfort or anger you may feel when talking about or understanding or acknowledging your privilege pales in comparison to the oppression that those on the other side of the coin deal with every day. So if you ever had difficulty talking to someone about privilege, or maybe you had trouble understanding it or even acknowledging it, tell us about it in the comments below, and we'll see you next week right here on Decoded. In our last sketch, we revealed the secret.
I feel like that was very, very well done, so I was very excited to share that with you. So again, with privilege, right? We're not like looking to not get our privilege anymore. We're trying to make sure everybody gets our privilege that isn't who we are, right? Like, what if we could make sure that every other race got all the benefits of what white people get with white privilege? That's what we're looking to do. We're not trying to say we shouldn't have it. We're saying everybody else should have that too, right? Same thing with heterosexual privilege, right? We want to make sure there's plenty of dating sites for trans people, for LGBTQ people, for folks that like are non-binary as far as how they represent with gender, right? Like everybody should be able to find love really easily. It shouldn't have to be hard, right? What we're trying to do is make sure everybody has the same level of access to privilege as anybody else, and that nobody's left behind. But with this, we have to understand certain words, because in the world, you are going to go try to talk about this stuff unless you have a language for which to discuss these things. You're going to find yourself in arguments or problems, right? So let's look at this idea of reverse racism. Reverse racism is an idea that a person of color can be racist against a white person. So the issue with the idea of reverse racism is it fails to acknowledge the power structure of racism, right? It fails to acknowledge that white people are the favored race above all other races, right? When you look at the Avengers, how many of those people are Asian? Like maybe the alien chick from like Guardians of the Galaxy, but you can't call her Asian because she's an alien, right? How many black people are there? You got Falcon and you got the Black Panther, right? Like how many Native Americans are there? None, right? So again, like when you see this, it's the constant favoring of white people over all other races. So when someone says reverse racism, this is what we would have to do linguistically to actually reverse racism. To really reverse racism, you would have to oppress white people and white people only, and favor every other race that exists in the world to really reverse racism. Systematically, that isn't possible in a one-on-one interaction, right? So when you think about like reversing something, like think about the idea of reverse sexism, where men are persecuted and favored over every other gender, right? Like we allowed non-binary trans people who are genderqueer in their expression, they're favored over men, right? Like what kind of world would that exist in? Really reversing sexism. Or a better way to understanding like reverse racism. How would we reverse classism? How would we persecute the rich and favor every other socioeconomic class other than the 1%, right? Like again, when you see how hard it is to truly reverse things, you get a sense of like, well, you can't reverse racism and you can't really reverse sexism because that would mean to oppress one social identity and favor every other social identity. It doesn't work that way. Now, that being said, are people mean and rude to white people? Yes, absolutely. Like what is happening there is called white discrimination. That is treating someone bad because they are white. And that is bad. But it's linguistically incorrect to call that reverse racism. That is white discrimination. Same thing with everything else. Is there discrimination against males? Yes. Is that reverse sexism? No. It's just discrimination on that person based on the fact that they're male, right? So understanding this and the way this works with language is incredibly important if we're going to understand the systems that are communicated around us that make the world the way that it is. Like that is incredibly important. So I got a little video that's a little bit more on reverse racism because I know when people talk about stuff, they're like, well, there's BET. So like, what's the white entertainment television, right? And I say, look, if you've ever watched Bob Ross, the painter on PBS, like that is not made for a Latinx audience, right? Like Native Americans aren't like, yes, Bob Ross is made for me specifically. Who was Bob Ross made for? Kind of like liberal white people, really, right? PBS watching white people. Or like the Lawrence Welk show. Like everybody on that show was white. Like, so if that's not like an example of white entertainment television, what is, right? So we need to understand reverse racism and getting to understand this idea of reverse racism and how you can't really reverse a system and process as big as racism. You have to understand like how privilege works to advantage one group at the cost of every other group specifically.
So here are some quick and dirty facts on reverse racism. 1. Reverse racism does not exist. 2. Reverse racism is not real. 3. No, seriously, it's not a thing. Things like BET, Black Girls Rock, or Black History Month are not reverse racist against white people. Because remember, in a society where white is seen as the default race, all history is white history. But racism isn't just someone feeling superior to another race and then discriminating against them. That's just the tip of a very messed up iceberg. Racism works on both an individual and societal level. Minorities have fewer opportunities to express prejudice against whites, and they lack the institutional power that protects them if they do. Let me reiterate. A black person expressing racial prejudice or backwards ideas about white people or any other race is not okay. But on a structural level, black prejudice does not affect the rights of white people. It doesn't affect the rate at which white people go to jail, experience police brutality, unemployment, poverty, or housing discrimination. Minorities deal with these realities at a much higher number. Someone with a white-sounding name is 50% more likely to get a job callback than someone with an ethnic-sounding name. Black people are more likely to be killed by police, and twice as likely to be killed while unarmed. What's the reverse of that? If you think about it, reverse racism would actually be kind of great, because it would mean that we live in a society where all racial groups have equal power. But we don't. So to those who cry reverse racism when a show like Blackish premieres or when President Obama uses the N-word, please, just stop.
Well, and again, one thing I want to correct here, right, is like reverse racism would still oppress somebody because it recognizes that there is one favored group. So if we did reverse racism, one group in particular would be persecuted, which would be white people. If we reverse sexism, one group would be persecuted, again, which would be males, right? But again, how to think about how that would happen systemically, right? It's like, it's almost mind-bending. Could you imagine living in a world where like men were catcalled, or like men were worried about rape every day from like everybody from every under their gender category? Like, it's kind of hard to like wrap your brain around that idea. So the problem of privilege and oppression. The problem is that some of our social identities are privilege. And that some parts of our social identities have privilege, right? As we learned in the stereotyping activity, that there are there's parts of our social identities that are oppressed, and there's parts of our social identities that are privileged, right? And understanding that like parts of us are overvalued and treated too good, as well as other parts of us are oppressed or stereotyped, means that like not one person is all privileged and not one person is all oppressed, right? It means that the world doesn't give us a sense of equality, treating everybody the same and everybody like they have value and worth, or equity, which is noticing who has the most need first, right? When we go to the emergency room, nobody gets seen all at the same time, right? Like if I go to the emergency room because like I'm having food poisoning, right? I don't get seen first, even though the guy behind me has a gunshot wound, right? The gunshot wound guy gets to go first because he has a greater need than I do, right? Equity is noticing who has the greater need and meeting the person with the greater need first, because that's truly what is fair. When privilege is normative is seen as normal, or is held up as the way to be, or the way to act, or the way to think, we get this idea called hegemony. Now, hegemony is a really hard word to unpack, right? But hegemony is predominant and pervasive influence of one culture over another, right? It's where, like, you know, nobody notices like white people hanging out in groups together, right? But when black people get together, people will be like, what are all those black people doing together? Nobody ever looks at Starbucks and be like, what are all those white people doing at Starbucks, right? Not in the same way. Whereas if there was a whole bunch of black people that were at Starbucks, we'd be like, what's going on at the Starbucks? So that like all these black people are there, right? Like gatherings of white people are kind of seen as normal. It's taken for granted. It's not analyzed, right? And hegemony, like the perceived way things should be, gives us a sense of this idea of cultural imperialism, right? A great example of hegemony is what happens on December 25th. Like on December 25th, can you go out and eat at any restaurant you want? No. Can you really avoid like hearing Christmas songs? No. Like, is it considered to be a great day to like celebrate your Muslim heritage? No. Right? Like, really the only things that are open on December 25th are movie theaters and Chinese food restaurants, as far as what has been considered normal throughout American history, right? And that leads to a sense of cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is the practice of a more powerful nation or a more powerful and privileged group that imposes its culture over marginalized nations or oppressed groups. This is why people push for happy holidays over Merry Christmas. Because as a Muslim person in America, when everybody's saying Merry Christmas, it's really uncomfortable. As a Jewish person in America, when you're walking around the world and everybody's telling you Merry Christmas, it's a little bit uncomfortable, right? The problem is people put that overvaluing of one culture on top of every other culture, and every other culture feels marginalized, not as important, and not as having the same value as every other culture, right? So let's look at an example of a hegemonic idea. We're going to look at an example with hegemony and gender expression and wealth and privilege with a gender group, like masculinity, right? So with the videos I'm going to show you, I am not condemning masculinity. I am a very masculine man, right? But we're going to look at how widespread masculinity and masculine culture is all across society. Because think about it. If a woman wants to be seen and respected at work, what does she need to do? She needs to take no guff. She can't play around. She can't joke. She needs to wear like pantsuits. She can't wear like flowing dresses, right? What does she have to do? She actually has to become more masculine at work to really be taken seriously. And that's how hegemony works, right? It just normalizes the process of these are what you got to do to be taken seriously. So let's look at examples of hegemonic masculinity and power and wealth as represented through Disney.
This presentation will be centered on how Disney films emphasize the idea of hegemonic masculinity and how it creates a negative effect on males. I'd like to bring to you the hegemonic masculinity that we almost forget is in classic Disney films because it's so normalized. Samara Green said, in The Little Mermaid, who provides Ariel with a shelter and future life of luxury? Prince Eric. In Cinderella, who works her out of rags and into riches? Prince Charming. In The Sleeping Beauty, who awakens Aurora from her wretched curse and saves the day? Prince Philip. The classic Disney plot is that a girl gets in trouble and then the man saves her. Although this is problematic for the female image, it is also showing that men have to live up to a certain stereotype as well. This quote perfectly explains the role of men and the hegemony surrounding them in Disney movies. Similarly to the Disney princesses, Disney men also have key characteristics that they are known for. The prince or hero must not only have strength and be brave, but they must also be handsome. Physical appearance is huge in Disney films. Everyone likes to say how the man falls in love with the beauty of the woman, but it is also worth noting that the woman falls in love with the man's outward appearance as well, describing him as charming and handsome. It is known that a Disney man must also have power and wealth to get the girl. This reverts directly to what society values in men and their required masculinity. Men must have power and wealth and show both of them off. Disney films send the message that to be considered a man, you need power to show your worth and to use it to get the girl. This is shown in Hercules. At first he is poor with no power and no love interest, but when he gets power and wealth, the love interest comes into play, which is all relative. Along with power, Disney films also teach men that they have to be a hero and must always save the girl. This asserts their dominance and in turn their masculinity. Men must use their power to help the girl, such as seen in Cinderella when Prince Charming brings her from rags to riches, and in Sleeping Beauty when Prince Philip uses physical power to slay the villain. This physical power plays into violence of hegemonic masculinity, as is illustrated in the next slide. Disney has always glorified violence when it is projected onto the villain. This shows boys that they must physically fight their battles with their strength, and if they succeed, they will become a hero. The glorification of violence leads to men showing aggression to prove their masculinity when they feel threatened, because after seeing Disney films, they think it's the only way to solve the problem. Most men pick fights instead of talking things out because they generally see it as a more manly thing to do to physically fight. In The Little Mermaid, Eric stabs the sea witch Ursula, effectively killing her, and he takes on the role of the hero. You don't see Ariel effectively fighting against Ursula, and this is because fighting and showing violence is a masculine act. Also, to be masculine, you must only show one emotion, and that is anger. This emotion is classified as masculine because it goes along with violence, which I described previously as being inherently masculine. Never once do you see a man cry or show fear in Disney movies, but Disney women show their emotions like an open book. To be masculine is to not be feminine, and women are stereotypically seen as being soft and weak. So naturally, men must be the opposite, for fear of being confused with a female. You can look further into hegemonic masculinity, violence, and lack of emotions as being a real-world problem that Disney helps create, because with this male image comes the problems of unnecessary abuse towards others, especially women. Men, generally, are afraid that if they show emotion, they will be labeled weak, so therefore they show dominance through anger and physical power. Both Snow White and Cinderella openly show fear towards their villains, while the men show anger and hatred. Disney also shows the main character as a leader. In order to assert masculine dominance, men in Disney films take control, even when the storyline is centered on the female. Disney men show this stereotypical masculinity when they bravely fight the terrifying dragon who guards the tower, or a giant evil sea witch. Like I have said before, showing fear is not masculine, and neither is asking for help. Disney portrays an independence that glorifies the bravery of the male hero, almost saying that if they did ask for help, their accomplishments would be diminished. Also, it is interesting to note that the men in Disney films assume that the woman wants to marry them, and they never ask for her hand in marriage. This is just another way they show their masculinity and dominance. This time, it is dominance over the woman. This translates into real life when some men assume that their opinion is more important than a woman's. In conclusion, although Disney movies are typically seen as something only girls watch, boys know the films just as well, and each group is affected negatively in some way. Each group learns to feed the stereotypes unknowingly. Disney films are just one of the many popular media pieces that emphasize the importance of hegemonic masculinity, which shouldn't be important at all.
So with that, I liked that video a lot because, like, I think about it, right? And when I was raised, like, people were like, you need to be ready to fight. You need to be able to hand yourself in a fight, you know, Professor D. And like I've worried about being able to fight and like learned how to fight and stuff like that. You know, the last time I got in a fight, 4th grade. Like, if the last time I got in a fight was 4th grade, is it really that important? But we see men all the time worried about like being able to fight and like being prepared for this stuff. And this is not really a problem that we need to be worrying about, right? And like one of the things that blew my mind in the Disney thing is when they were like, the guys never asked the girls to marry them. Like, that's bananas. Like, at the very least, they should be getting like a ring and getting down on the knee, right? But it's so messed up. Like, they're just like, oh, you're a man, you're awesome, you solved my problems, here, let's get married, right? Another problematic issue that we see is that certain social identities are seen as normal, and situations and circumstances are seen as expected, right? And this sense of like what is normal and what is expected causes problems because some people aren't normal or what is expected. And that's what makes it so difficult. Now, the next two slides are a video about the something called the equal opportunity race as through the lens of race. But that's all video, right? It's all what you see. So please go to the slides and watch that because it's not going to be very helpful for us here. So I'm going to not really cover that. But it's important to get a sense of like what's going on with stuff there, right? Because as an individual, privilege is not your fault. You didn't choose to have white privilege. You didn't choose to have male privilege. You didn't choose to have like body image privilege, like if your body is considered normal, not overweight, not underweight. But we live in a society where some social identities are overvalued systemically, and some people are systemically undervalued over and over and over again. So like when we think about our privilege, I see it as a responsibility to use our privilege that we didn't earn on behalf of others that don't have it. Because there's a problem called systemic racism. And there's not just systemic racism, there's systemic classism, there's systemic sexism, there's homophobia basically everywhere, right? But it is the notion or idea that human traits and capacities, that there is it's the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a certain race. The thing that I really like, right, is a doctrine or political program, like it's an idea which is communicated, that assumes race, like has a hierarchy to it and is like executed on those principles, right? So let's look at what a systemic definition of racism will look like in this video.
In light of all that's taking place today, there's so many questions. The division, the conflict, the misunderstanding. I thought I would take a moment to address one of the subjects that regularly comes up that people are confused about, and that is, what is systemic racism? Well, first of all, let's define racism. Racism is the conscious or unconscious belief in the superiority of one's race over and against another race. That feeling, that belief, gets manifested in the use of power or influence or resources or even communication that seeks to reject or marginalize or even oppress a person of another color, race, or ethnicity. When we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the presence of racism, as we've just defined it, being embedded into the structures of society, whether those structures are political or economic or legal or medical or related to housing or employment. It is where it has become part of the policies or procedures of the way a particular entity operates. Of course, we're all aware of the evil system of slavery. That was a legal system that oppressed a group of people because of the color of their skin. But that got embedded into other structures in society. For example, criminal justice. There was a practice called peonage or debt servitude, where after the 13th Amendment was established granting freedom to slaves, there was a clause that said unless you're a criminal. So what was done was the criminalizing of men for the most minor of infractions so that the 13th Amendment could not be applied. And they would be held in servitude, oftentimes way beyond what they were arrested for, and many times they were arrested for little or nothing, in order to keep them from being able to claim the freedom that was being granted by the 13th Amendment. It showed up in the way people were denied employment or educational opportunities, or being able to access the goods and services during Jim Crow segregation. It showed up in churches that were unwilling to accept people of a different race because of the color of their skin. Or I can speak personally when I was told when I was trying to enter into media ministry that a black speaker would offend too many of our white listeners. There was a system at work that was denying equal opportunity and equal access. Those systems, while a person may not be personally a racist, can be supported by supporting the structure that is that way. And unless you're not only not a racist, but that you speak against racism where it shows up, they can continue to be part of the fiber of a particular way, a particular structure operates. When you understand that in a race, some people, if they are allowed to get started quicker and faster, or start at a starting point much ahead of where another group is, that the group behind has to play catch up. And at least being empathetic and sympathetic, that has been a historical reality, not only in people's personal views, but in the structures that people have believed in, supported, affirmed. Then you understand why there is a catch-up that needs to take place. And when you understand that, appreciate that, and grasp that, it does give you a different sensitivity to the reality. Now, of course, that sensitivity must be handled in not only an empathetic way, but a responsible way. So at the same time, just knowing that people have been held back, people of color have been held back by structures, not just by individuals, helps you to understand why certain elements within our society need to be corrected so that equal opportunity is granted, the granting that God gives all men, and the granting that the United States offers to all of us as well.
So even with that, right, we start to hear that guy talking and he says all men, right? And you're like, well, that's already leaving out people, right? But again, it gives you a sense of what systemic racism is and how it might work. Now, what would it look like to use one's privilege on behalf of those that don't have the same opportunities? Well, it would look a little bit like making sure that things would end up fair, but at first it's going to sound like unfair, right? But we have to notice who has the ability to get something, who has the access to get something, who has the resources to get something, and who doesn't, and then finding a way to get what the people who don't have stuff need most first, because they've been living longest without it. And again, the emergency room is a great example. Here is another great example of what that looks like, right? We live in a world where we believe we want to see equality. Everybody gets the same and everybody is the same. But it doesn't recognize that the world is different for some people.
Today we are talking about equity and equality. But you might be wondering, wait, aren't these the same thing? They look the same. They sound similar. So aren't they the same? No, in fact, they're really different concepts, even though a lot of us get the two confused. So let's break them down. You probably already know what we mean when we say equality. We're talking about two things that are the same or have a similar value. When we treat two people or two groups of people equally, we make sure that they have or get the same things. For example, if I want to give Betty some apples, then I need to give Ben the same number of apples to treat them with equality. Along the same lines, if I want to give the nursing program a budget increase, then I need to make sure that I give the culinary arts program the same budget increase to treat them with equality. That makes sense. But that's not the same thing as equity. Equity can be defined as giving everyone what they need to be successful. In other words, it's not giving everyone the exact same thing. And here's where the difference between equity and equality really come in. Because it's important to remember that if we give everyone the exact same thing, expecting that we'll make people equal, it assumes that everyone started out in the same place. So here's an example. In this instance, we give everyone the exact same box. We treat them with equality so that they can see over the fence. Well, that's great for the person on the left because they were already taller. But it's not so great for the person on the right who still can't see over the fence. From an equity perspective, we wouldn't want everyone to have the same size box because everyone isn't the same height to start out with. With an equity mindset, we would give everyone what they need to raise them up to the same level. Here's another example. With equality in mind, we can treat everyone the same and give them all the same bike. But that doesn't really help the person on the left who can't ride that kind of bike, or the person in the middle that is too small for that bike. So when we think about this situation with equity in mind, equity tells us that we need to give everybody a different kind of bike so they can all enjoy a bike ride. As you might guess, this is where the concept of fairness gets tricky for some folks. We often think that being fair means that everybody gets the same thing, and that's what we were taught when we were growing up. But fairness really only works when we're all the same to start out with. So this is a new idea for many of us to think about. There's this great American saying that people just need to work hard enough and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's this idea that everyone can be successful if you just work hard enough. Well, that's a lot easier to do when some of us were born with longer arms to pull up those bootstraps, or maybe we were given longer bootstraps when we bought our boots. So let's think about moving away from the bootstrap idea and instead think about shoes. There's a quote by Naheed Dasani that goes, "Equality is giving everyone a shoe, but equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits."
So again, I thought that was just a great idea, a great way of summarizing that idea and notion. And this brings us back to intercultural communication, is we need to understand who we're talking with, what their life experience is like, and what they're dealing with as a person, and then communicate in a way with them that respects the life experience that they have and value the idea that this is actually different. Like, people are different. Noticing that people are different is important, especially if we're going to communicate and truly understand each other across cultural differences. And the other thing that's really important to notice is privilege, while uncomfortable and it's giving us more than we really deserve, it's also the capacity to make a difference for somebody. When we're privileged, it's easier to make a difference for somebody else that doesn't have privilege because we have the capacity to do something for them in a way that they can't do for themselves. But we got to be careful in the way that we do it. We have to ask, hey, can you use my help? Hey, are you comfortable with me making a difference here? Are you comfortable with me talking about the other things, right? Like, are you comfortable with me being part of this difference for you? Because we don't want to just assume things for people and just start doing things for people. That becomes a big problem too. But privilege is the capacity to help. Let's watch this video about privilege as the capacity to help.
Incidents of racism are in the news almost every day. In the worst cases, they're deadly. Like that of Stefan Koch, who shot 20 times in his backyard last month after police allegedly mistook a cell phone for a gun, or nearly did. Like that of Michigan teenager who was shot when he tried to ask for directions how to way home. Then there are the other cases that are just plain outrageous, like the two men who refused to leave Starbucks several days ago and ended up getting arrested for trespassing. And this latest of 5 women who were trying to enjoy a game of golf at their club, a club they all belonged to, when they were told they were playing too slowly, the situation escalated. And police did arrive, and the group was not arrested, but still, really, golfing while black and the police are called whites like me tend to decry these things and then move on. The Boston Globe columnist Renee Greenwald, we need to do more and use what she terms white privilege and not just feel guilty about it all, but to do something about it. Is she right? You joined our show with Young, Boston Globe business columnist, Judy Sugar, and recently named by Boston Magazine as one of the most influential people in Boston. Congratulations, nice to see you, Shirley. Michael Jeffries, a sociologist and urban studies professor at Boston College, University of City. What's your quick reaction? This fascinating thing totally put me over the edge. What's your reaction?
Oh, it's awful, and especially after the Starbucks incident, right? And what was crazy was they were members of the club, and so you got to think that there was something else going on.
Well, I think the R word is that's racist. What's your take on this?
The thing that's so difficult about it is it doesn't seem like the attention that these other events and incidents get has any immediate impact, right? So we said it was right after the Starbucks thing, which was a huge national story. Right in the backyard didn't seem to get taken down.
Cherno had an explanation. I think it's a pretty good one. Here he is.
Black people can't win in America, right? If you advance on white people, you're a threat. If you run away from them, you're suspicious. And now they call the cops on you when you take your time, it's golf. That's what golf is for. But you know what the problem in America is that white people call the police like they're asking for the manager.
I'm trying to think. Can we step back and talk? Renee didn't use these words. Renee didn't use these words. But here's my takeaway: is that there's too much talking by people.
Oh, dang it. I'm going to go back to where we were.
Tension that these other events and incidents get has any impact, right? So we said it was right after the Starbucks thing, which was a huge national story. Right in the backyard didn't seem to get taken down.
Cherno had an explanation. I think it's a pretty good one. Here he is.
Black people can't win in America, right? If you advance on white people, you're a threat. If you run away from them, you're suspicious. And now they call the cops on you when you take your time, it's golf. That's what golf is for. But you know what the problem in America is that white people call the police like they're asking for the manager.
I'm trying to think. Can we step back and talk? Renee didn't use these words. Renee didn't use these words. But here's my takeaway: is that there's too much talking by people like me. There's too much guilt by people like me, but not enough doing. Do you think that's an accurate characterization of the state of the world in 2018?
Yes, and I love this piece by my colleague Renee Graham. She said, turn your white privilege, white guilt into action, and it's something that I've also written about too. White men, in this town is dominated by white men. Instead of excluding them about diversity and inclusion talk, make them the leaders of it.
You just wrote this thing about tourism, where you got action, by the way.
Exactly.
No people of color in the finals.
Right, and I that story, that came from, I had white sources. Because there were people of color involved, and so.
White sources who were concerned about the fact.
And dropped dimes to me, so I'm just saying, exactly, they were using white privilege. They were taking it, instead of using their position for change.
First when I read this morning, there's a little piece of me that I would say bristled, but step back, and then I said, I can count on one hand the amount of times in recent days, there's 2 Starbucks people, the videographer, the video person, and the guy who had a meeting with him. I mean, there's so few instances, so she has nailed this, has she not?
Absolutely, and it's easier, I think, to recall or to worry about those times when there's an incident happening, and there's an opportunity, an obvious opportunity for a white bystander or observer to step in, either take a video or ask the police what's going on. But there are other opportunities, more hidden opportunities, for people to use their white privilege for progressive means that aren't acted upon or recognized all the time. Right, so for example, I think there are all kinds of examples in your place of worship or at your workplace or in your home where white families are talking amongst themselves and they let a joke go by, or it's something that's not quite a racist slur go by, because, well, it's just my crazy uncle doing it or my crazy coworker doing it. But those opportunities in white spaces, not when there's a near deadly incident, that's not the only chance you have to use your privilege to interrupt something. Interrupt it when you're among white friends and white colleagues too. That's a chance to make progress.
One of the issues, I don't disagree with that at all, but Shirley, I don't know where the line is. We talked about this on the radio today that separates welcome ally to unwelcome white savior. And one of the reasons when we get out, I think, is so huge because they're black victims who are actually not rescued by a white person, they're actually rescued by a black person. How do you not stride the line where I'm going to come in and save black people from the crap that they have to live with every day?
I'm glad you brought this up because I recently was on this panel and I was moderating with Tom Croswell, who is this
about race.
the white CEO of Tufts Healthcare, and he came and he's like a white CEO of Central Casting, and he comes in and he hires a VP of business diversity and does all these things. And I ask him questions like, do you feel like how does it feel like to be a white guy championing, carrying the flag of diversity? And he said, how do you be authentic about it? He's like, listen, does it make me uncomfortable? Yes. And you have to get uncomfortable. This is an uncomfortable process, and white people have to get uncomfortable and figure it out and talk to a lot of people. It's going to be an uncomfortable process, but go there. It's okay.
You're not in agreement here, but first of all, I can't stand the term white privilege. I mean, because I say, how dare they? I mean, it gives me the creeps, even though I think it's probably intellectually accurate. But I'm thinking, as Shirley's talking, the Parkland kids are celebrated in one form. And in other forms, we hear, well, the only reason anybody's paying attention to these kids is because for the most part, honestly, for the most part, they're rich white kids. They did reach out to people of color in Chicago, etc. But there's a lot of that criticism. Again, they're using their white privilege when they were just really reacting to
I think the way that they have sort of turned that story on its head and the efforts that they went to include voices of color and students from their own school, especially in the march that happened after all the activism in the park, is an example of what's necessary in order to use that privilege for something good. And I think part of what's happening here is, right, if you want to avoid the white savior thing, part of it is you have to get involved and stay involved and not be timid about it, but the other part of it is you have to know when to step back and cede authority to people of color who have been working on these issues long before the white CEO was, right? And that's another huge piece of this is stepping back, using your power to step back and give someone else.
Well, that's the criticism of the Women's March, by the way. Long before the gun march, the white leaders were not stepping back for people of color. You understand the white privilege thing just for a second. In an era when there's so much division, and this is not original phobia, I read some brilliant pieces about this during the Trump campaign. A guy making $15,000 or a woman in Pennsylvania, like your Matt Wise wrote a brilliant piece about Butler, Pennsylvania. Almost all white, almost all voted, graduated class 76, almost all voted for Trump, not misogynist, not Islamophobes, not racist, etc. They can't afford to send their kid to college, they can't afford to retire, they can't afford to go on vacation. When they hear you have to use your white privilege, and maybe they do have, a similarly situated black doesn't have what they have, they recoil at that. And shouldn't they recoil at that? They're suffering big time. Maybe not as much, again, as a black or Latino or nation in the same circumstance, but shouldn't they? Well, if you're a working class white guy in Butler, Pennsylvania, you don't want to hear somebody saying use your white privilege.
Well, that's probably true that they're not doing that there, but I mean, I think this is more, I guess I'm thinking about Boston, and there are a lot of people, white people who are liberal, who want to help, and I feel like there's a lot to be done here, and Renee Brand's piece really struck a chord, because I think there are a lot of people out there who don't know what to do, who are just bystanders, and don't realize that bystanders play a huge role, and there needs to be more training, more discussion, more conversation in workplaces everywhere.
Only 15 seconds left. How do you enter the discomfort zone that you're both suggesting that we enter?
I think there are all kinds of models for it already, but I think it starts with talking with people you're comfortable talking to. Don't always feel like you have to step up and enter this kind of foreign conversation. Start with your siblings, start with your friends you grew up with, start with your coworkers. That's a great first step.
You gotta go, Shirley. It's great to see you. It's always my pleasure. Thanks for being there.
So again, I felt like that was a great example of like kind of talking about and really thinking about and considering ways that people could use their privilege on other people's behalfs. But we've been kind of talking about race a lot. Let's look at things through the lens of gender. How might we use male privilege to work for others to make a difference for them in ways they need it?
Before I begin my presentation, I want to say it's a great honor for me to be part of a program with so many impressive women. I also want to say, and thank you to the organizers to invite me to be part of this. It's important that I say, and that men say, when we do the work that we do, especially in the field of gender violence prevention that I'm going to talk to you about this morning, it's important that we acknowledge that the growing movement of men in the United States, in a multicultural sense, and all around the world in an international sense, the growing movement of men who are standing up and speaking out about men's violence against women, going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them. That movement of men is indebted to the leadership of women. On a personal level, on a professional level, on a political level, on an intellectual level, on every level, women built these movements. And these are movements that are affecting, in a positive way, everybody, not just women and girls, but also men and boys. And oftentimes men like myself get a lot of credit and public acclaim for doing the work that women have been doing for a long time. So one of the ways that we can use the spotlight is to thank women and honor women's leadership going forward today, tomorrow, and into the future. Now, having said that, I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issue of gender violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children. That whole range of issues that are referred to in shorthand as gender violence issues. They've been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. But I have a problem with that frame, and I don't accept it. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues, first and foremost. Now, obviously, they're also women's issues, so I appreciate that. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem for a number of reasons. The first is it gives men an excuse not to pay attention. Right? A lot of men hear the term women's issue, and we tend to tune it out. We think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls, that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence. As a result, something chip in our brain is activated, and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true, by the way, of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender, and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. Let's talk for a moment about race. In the U.S., when you hear the word race, a lot of people think that means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, on and on. A lot of people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And a lot of people, when they hear the word gender, think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways the dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege. The ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. This is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school in some fundamental regards. I make films, I work with high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I'm going to share with you this exercise that illustrates on a sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way we use language, inspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, Pete is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which said the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We should our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John, it's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term used synonymous beaten is battered, so here we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in the sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was unheard by John in the first instance. We demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm. Which is to say, blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why are these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do you keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What stupid thing to do? Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women. Okay, it's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear. Asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. You can see where I'm going with this, right? The questions are not about Mary, they're about John. The questions include things like, why does John beat Mary? Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why so many men abused physically, emotionally, and verbally, in other ways, the women, girls, and the men, boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men? Why so many adult men sexually abuse little girls and little boys? Why is that a common problem in our society and all over the world today? Why do we hear over and over again about new scandals erupting in major institutions like the Catholic Church, the Penn State football program, with the Boy Scouts of America, on and on and on, in local communities all over the country and all over the world, right? We hear about it all the time. Sexual abuse of children. What's going on with men? Why so many men rape women in our society and around the world? Why so many men rape other men? What's going on with men? And then what is the role of the various institutions in our society that are helping to produce abuse of men at pandemic rates? This isn't about individual perpetrators. That's a naive way of understanding what is a much deeper and more systematic social problem. You know, the perpetrators aren't these monsters who crawl out of the swamp and come into town and do their nasty business and then retreat into the darkness. That's a very naive notion, right? Perpetrators are much more normal than that, every day than that. So the question is, what are we doing here in our society and in the world? What are the roles of the various institutions in helping to produce abuse of men? What are the role of religious belief systems, the sports culture, the pornography culture, the family structure, economics, and how that intersects, and race and ethnicity, and how that intersects? How does all this work? And then once we start making those kind of connections and asking those important and big questions, then we talk about how can we be transformative? How can we do something differently? How can we change the practice? How can we change the socialization of boys and the definition of manhood that lead to these current outcomes? These are the kind of questions that we need to be asking and the kind of work we need to be doing. But if we're endlessly focused on what women are doing and thinking in relationships or elsewhere, we're not going to get to that piece. Now, I understand that a lot of women who've been trying to speak out about these issues today and yesterday and for years and years often get shouted down for their efforts. They get called nasty names like male basher and man hater and disgusting and offensive feminazi. Right? You know what all this is about? It's called kill the messenger. It's that the women were standing up and speaking out for themselves and for other women, as well as for men and boys. It's a statement to them to sit down and shut up. Keep the current system in place, because we don't like when people rock the boat. We don't like when people challenge our power. You gotta sit down and shut up, basically. And thank goodness that women haven't done that. Thank goodness that we live in a world where there's so much women's leadership that can counteract that. But one of the powerful roles that men can play in this work is that we can say some things that sometimes women can't say. Or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women often can't be heard saying. Now, I appreciate that's a problem, it's sexism, but it's the truth. And so one thing that I say to men, and my colleagues and I always say this, is we need more men who have the courage and strength to start standing up and saying some of this stuff. And standing with women, not against them, pretending somehow this is a battle between the sexes and other kinds of nonsense. We live in a world together. And by the way, one of the things that really bothers me about some of the rhetoric against feminists and others who build the battle women's and great crisis movements around the world is that somehow, like I said, they're anti-male. What about all the boys who are profoundly affected in a negative way by what some adult man is doing against their mother, themselves, their sisters? What about all those boys? What about all the young men and boys who have been traumatized by adult men's violence? You know what? The same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. If you want to talk about male victims, let's talk about male victims. Most male victims of violence are the victims of other men's violence. So that's something that both women and men have in common. We are both victims of men's violence. So we have it in our direct self-interest. Not to mention the fact that most men that I know have women and girls that we care deeply about in our families and our friendship circles and every other way. So there's so many reasons why we need men to speak out. It seems obvious saying it out loud, doesn't it? Now, the nature of the work that I do and my colleagues do in the sports culture, in the U.S. military, in schools, we pioneered this approach called the bystander approach to the gender violence prevention. And I just want to give you the highlights of the bystander approach because it's a big sort of thematic shift, although there's lots of particulars. But the heart of it is, instead of seeing men as perpetrators, women as victims, or women as perpetrators, men as victims, or any combination, I'm using gender binary, I know there's more than men and women, there's more than male and female, and there are women who are perpetrators, and of course there are men who are victims. There's a whole spectrum. But instead of seeing it in the binary fashion, we focus on all of us as what we call bystanders. And bystanders is defined as anybody who's not a perpetrator or a victim in a given situation. So in other words, friends, teammates, colleagues, co-workers, family members, those of us who are not directly involved in a dyad of abuse, but we are embedded in social, family, work, school, and other peer cultural relationships with people who might be in that situation. What do we do? How do we speak out? How do we challenge our friends? How do we support our friends? But how do we not remain silent in the face of abuse? Now, when it comes to men and male culture, the goal is to get men who are not abusive to challenge men who are. And when I say abusive, I don't mean just men who are beating women. I'm not saying that a man whose friend is abusing his girlfriend needs to stop a guy at the moment of attack. I mean, that's a naive way of creating a social change. It's along a continuum. We're trying to get men to interrupt each other. So, for example, if you're a guy, you're in a group of guys playing poker, talking, hanging out, no women present, and another guy says something sexist or degrading or harassing about women, instead of laughing along or pretending you didn't hear it, we need men to say, hey, that's not funny. You might sister talking about it, you joke about something else. Well, if you talk about something else, I don't appreciate that kind of talk. Just like if you're a white person and another white person makes a racist comment, I hope that white people interrupt that racist enactment by a fellow white person. Just like with heterosexism, if you're a heterosexual person and you yourself don't enact harassing or abusive behaviors towards people of varying sexual orientations, if you don't say something in the face of other heterosexual people doing that, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity? Well, the bystander approach is trying to give people tools to interrupt that process and to speak out and to create a peer culture climate where the abusive behavior will be seen as unacceptable, not just because it's illegal, but because it's wrong and unacceptable in the peer culture. If we can get to the place where men who act out in sexist ways will lose status, young men and boys who act out in sexist and harassing ways towards girls and women, as well as towards other boys and men, will lose status as a result of it, guess what? We'll see a radical diminution of the abuse, because the typical perpetrator is not sick and twisted, he's a normal guy in every other way, isn't it? Now, among the many great things that Martin Luther King said in his short life for us, in the end, what hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the end, what hurt the most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. There's been an awful lot of silence in male culture about this ongoing tragedy of men's violence against women and children, hasn't there? There's been an awful lot of silence. And all I'm saying is that we need to break that silence, and we need more men to do that. Now, it's easier said than done. I'm saying it now, but I'm telling you, it's not easy in male culture for guys to challenge each other, which is one of the reasons why part of the paradigm shift that has to happen is not just understanding these issues as men's issues, but they're also leadership issues for men. Because ultimately, the responsibility for taking a stand on these issues should not fall on the shoulders of boys or teenage boys in high school or college men. It should be on adult men with power. Adult men with power are the ones we need to be holding accountable for being leaders on these issues. Because when somebody speaks up in a peer culture and challenges and interrupts, he or she is being a leader, really, right? But on a big scale, we need more adult men with power to start prioritizing these issues. And we haven't seen that yet, have we? Now, I was at dinner a number of years ago, and I worked extensively with the U.S. military, all the services. And I was at this dinner, and someone said to me, I think she thought she was a little clever, she said, so how long have you been doing sensitivity training with the Marines? And I said, with all due respect, I don't do sensitivity training with the Marines. I run a leadership program in the Marine Corps. Now, I know it's my response, but it's an important distinction because I don't believe that what we need is sensitivity training. We need leadership training. Because, for example, when a professional coach or manager of a baseball team or football team, and I work extensively in that realm as well, makes a sexist comment, makes a homophobic statement, makes a racist comment. There'll be discussions on sports blogs and in sports talk radio, and some people say, well, he needs sensitivity training. Other people say, get off it, this political correctness running amok. He's made a stupid statement, move on. My argument is he doesn't need sensitivity training. He needs leadership training because he's being a bad leader. Because in a society with gender diversity and sexual diversity, and racial and ethnic diversity, you make those kind of comments, you're failing at your leadership. If we can make this point that I'm making to powerful men and women in our society at all levels, institutional authority and power, it's going to change. It's going to change the paradigm of people's thinking. You know, for example, I work a lot in college and university athletics throughout North America, right? We know so much about how to prevent domestic and sexual violence, right? There's no excuse for a college or university to not have domestic and sexual violence prevention training mandated for all student athletes, coaches, and administrators as part of their educational process. We know enough to know that we can easily do that. But you know what's missing? The leadership. But not the leadership of student athletes. It's the leadership of the athletic director, the president of the university, the people in charge who make decisions about resources, who make decisions about priorities in the institutional settings, right? That's a failure in most cases of men's leadership. Look at Penn State. Penn State is the mother of all teachable moments for the bystander approach. You had so many situations in that realm where men in powerful positions failed to act to protect children, in this case boys. It's unbelievable, really. But when you get into it, you realize there are pressures on men. There are constraints within peer cultures on men, which is why we need to encourage men to break through those pressures. And one of the ways to do that is to say there's an awful lot of men who care deeply about these issues. I know this. I work with men. I've been working with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men for many, many decades now. It's scary when you think about it, how many years. But there's so many men who care deeply about these issues, but caring deeply is not enough. We need more men with the guts, with the courage, with the strength, with the moral integrity to break our complicit silence and challenge each other and stand with women, not against them. By the way, we owe it to women. There's no question about it. But we also owe it to our sons. We also owe it to young men who are growing up all over the world in situations where they didn't make the choice to be a man in a culture that tells them a man is a certain way. They didn't make the choice. We have to have a choice, have an opportunity and responsibility to them as well. I hope that going forward, men and women working together can begin the change and the transformation that will happen so that future generations won't have the level of tragedy that we deal with on a daily basis. I know we can do it. We can do better. Thank you very much.
So I absolutely love Jackson Katz. And I, as a man, as a masculine man, got no problem saying I absolutely love Jackson Katz, man. Like, but do you see how we get an idea of how we communicate about things in the world shapes our reality and shapes our experience of reality? He shows us how we can be intentional about how we see things or understand thoughts and ideas, how we can think about things and thoughts and ideas, and more importantly, how can we change the way we talk about things? Because when we communicate about certain things, we can reshape the world in a better and more fair way that creates new opportunities for other people that are part of socially oppressed identities. We literally speak oppression into existence, and we speak oppression, or we speak privilege into existence. But when we change the way we talk, when we challenge notions and ideas and ways of thinking, we can actually change the world we live in. When we can better understand the ramifications of privilege and better understand the ramifications of oppression, we can be more mindful in our communication and be more culturally competent and literally liberate the people around us by liberating them from stereotypes, from understanding what bias does to lead us to the same things over and over again. We can create a world where everybody is privileged and no one's oppressed. We can create a world where people don't have to be scared or afraid to be who they really are. But to do so, we're going to have to own our privilege. And I'm going to tell you, that is a really uncomfortable process. But I believe in you, and I believe that you're strong enough people to do this. And I know when you looked at this video and you were like, wow, an hour and 15 minutes, man, that's a lot. But it's because I had a lot to unpack with you. And you have taken us incredibly far where we are in class so far. And I understand this is we're beginning the difficult, hard work now. But I trust and believe in you enough to be strong enough to be able to look at these issues, to own where you need to get better, and to change how you talk about stuff, right? It's not battered women. It's about men that got beating women issues, or beating people up in general issues, right? We want to talk about things in a way that rebalances the power structure in the world to make it more fair for all people. And so we gotta be aware how we think about things, how we choose to see things, how we begin to talk about things can either liberate people or oppress people. What we need to do is be intentional about taking on the responsibility for doing that in a way that makes a difference for others. Until we do, nothing's going to change. But everything starts within us. And if we're willing to take on the personal responsibility for speaking in a way that makes people become slowly aware of their privilege, speaking in a way that makes people aware of how people are oppressed unfairly, speaking about equity, and that, yeah, it's going to look unfair at getting the resources to people who need stuff most, is important. That's what's going to make us truly culturally competent, because we see and notice the differences, we see and celebrate the differences, and we create spaces of inclusion and mutual acceptance in the way we think, say, and do things in the world. And that's how we communicate change in a way that we need to see to make the world the place that we hope to live in. With that, thank you for your time and attention. Peace and blessings to all of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections.